Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
They say your wedding day is supposed to be the happiest day of your life, right? That's what everyone tells you. That's what all those picture-perfect bridal magazines sell you. The flawless dress, the smiling families, the champagne toasts, the dancing under twinkling lights. And for a little while, I actually believed I was getting all of that. I really did. I believed that maybe, just maybe, life was finally giving me a fair shot. The morning started like a scene from a movie, soft sunlight through the curtains, the smell of fresh flowers, my bridesmaids laughing as they zipped up their dresses, and me sitting in a chair while the makeup artist worked her magic. I kept glancing at my reflection in the mirror, half expecting to wake up from the dream. I looked like someone out of a catalog, and deep down, that terrified me. Because I've never belonged in catalogs. I've always belonged in hard work, scraped knees, and late rent. I'm not the daughter of country club members. I'm the daughter of a mechanic who worked double shifts and a mother who did payroll for a dry cleaner. Still, I tried to convince myself that maybe love really does level the playing field. Andrew, my fiancé, no, my almost husband, was everything I never thought I'd find. Gentle, smart, funny in a way that didn't try too hard. The kind of man who made me feel seen in a way no one ever had. But he also came from the kind of family that treats people like me with polite smiles and tightly clenched jaws. The kind of people who offer you sparkling water while wondering how much your shoes cost. The kind who throw charity galas for causes they don't care about, just to have their names engraved on plaques. I noticed it the moment I walked into the bridal suite at the venue. Robert and Elaine Whitmore, Andrew's parents, greeted me with what I can only describe as robotic warmth. Elaine kissed my cheek like I was some distant relative she barely tolerated, and Robert didn't even bother with that. He just nodded, eyes scanning me from head to toe like he was evaluating a used car he wasn't sure he wanted to buy. Still, I smiled. I played nice. I told myself it didn't matter. They were just part of the package. I wasn't marrying them. I was marrying Andrew. The ceremony was beautiful, I'll give them that. Flowers everywhere, strings of soft golden lights hanging from the ceiling, a string quartet playing in the background. People cried when I walked down the aisle, and for a brief moment I let myself believe I had done it. I had crossed the invisible bridge from my life to theirs. I could feel the eyes on me, and for once I didn't shrink under them. I was proud. Nervous, yes. But proud. We said our vows. Andrew's hands trembled slightly when he slipped the ring onto my finger. I looked at him, really looked, and I thought, this is it. This is home now. The reception started off smoothly. The food was perfect, the drinks were flowing, the laughter echoing off the walls. I danced with my brother Jake, who whispered in my ear, "You still sure about all this?" I laughed it off, thinking he was just being overprotective. Jake had never liked the Whitmores, especially Robert. Said there was something oily about him. Something cold-blooded behind those polished cufflinks and expensive cologne. But I brushed it off. I told myself Jake was just uncomfortable being surrounded by money and people who pronounce their R's a little too hard. Then came the toasts. My maid of honor, Maya, made everyone laugh with stories about our college years. My mother cried through her short, heartfelt speech. Everything felt warm, familiar, even magical. I was starting to exhale, starting to think maybe this could all work. Maybe this fractured puzzle of two different worlds could actually fit together. Then Robert stood up. I remember the sound of his chair scraping the floor. The way the room hushed almost instantly, like the air itself knew something was off. He raised his glass slowly, looked right at me, and smiled. Not a warm smile. Not a father's smile. It was something else, cool, rehearsed, like a man about to read a verdict instead of a blessing. And then he opened his mouth. And just like that, the perfect day began to rot. I should have known from the way he cleared his throat that whatever was about to come out of Robert Whitmore's mouth wasn't going to be a toast. Not really. Not in the way everyone expected. He stood there, polished and proud, in his tailored navy suit with a gold pocket square that probably cost more than my first car, holding his glass like it was a weapon instead of a celebration. His smile was thin and stretched, like it hurt to keep it in place, and his eyes scanned the room as if he were preparing for an announcement, not a warm fatherly moment. He started slow, methodical, with that same smarmy tone he always used when talking to waitstaff or anyone who wasn't wearing a Rolex. "Tonight, we celebrate a joining of families," he said, and there was an immediate shift in the room's air, polite attention, heads nodding, cameras raised. "It's a big moment for the Whitmores," he continued, "a moment of legacy, tradition, and values being carried forward." I felt Andrew's hand on mine under the table, his fingers tightening just slightly, and I knew. He felt it too. Something was coming. "And of course," Robert went on, "we welcome Katie into our circle. Though I'll admit, and this is when the shift turned into something sharper, colder, I've had my reservations." A few people chuckled nervously, thinking it was a joke, one of those awkward father-in-law gags that gets smoothed over with a sip of wine and a forced laugh. But he didn't smile. He didn't backpedal. He looked right at me, like I was the only person in the room. "I've always envisioned Andrew marrying someone who truly reflects the standards we've upheld in this family for generations," he said, and you could practically hear the heartbeat of the room pause. "Someone of refinement, of pedigree, of shared values and upbringing." The silence got thicker. You could feel it pressing against your ears. Forks froze midair, hands tightened around wine stems, and the music seemed to fade into the walls. "But love," he continued, with that damn condescending smirk, "has a way of taking us on detours. Some temporary, some enlightening." I saw Maya from across the room, her mouth slightly open, eyes wide with disbelief. Jake had straightened in his seat, his jaw tight enough to crack. My mother's face was flushed red, her hands clasped in her lap like she was holding herself together one thread at a time. "And while I've tried to embrace this arrangement," Robert went on, emphasizing the word like it was some kind of prison sentence, "I must be honest. I don't believe Katie is a suitable addition to this family. She lacks the grace, the background, and, frankly, the polish that we expect." I heard a gasp, maybe two. Someone's chair creaked as they shifted uncomfortably. My stomach was burning, not with sadness, but with something darker rising in my throat, humiliation wrapped in fury. "She's a lovely woman, I'm sure," he added like a damn afterthought. "But let's not pretend this is some fairy tale. She's a phase. And if we're honest with ourselves, we all know it." I swear to God, for a second, I forgot to breathe. The noise in the room died entirely. It was a vacuum of disbelief. Elaine sat frozen beside him, not even blinking. Andrew stared down at his plate like the shrimp cocktail was suddenly the most fascinating thing in the world. He didn't look at me. Not once. "Let me ask you something. Have you ever had someone look you straight in the eyes and tell you you're not good enough? Right there, in front of everyone you love? In front of your mother, your friends, your childhood neighbor who flew in just to see you walk down the aisle? What would you have done in my place? Be honest. Would you have swallowed your pride and smiled through it just to keep the peace? Or would you have stood up, grabbed the mic, and burned it all down? Because I'll tell you what I did." I sat there for a few seconds, staring at Robert like I was seeing him clearly for the very first time, stripped of the charm, the wealth, the polished lies. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out. I didn't cause a scene, at least not yet. Instead, I reached slowly for the microphone resting on the table, stood up, and smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile you give in a wedding photo. It wasn't the smile of a bride basking in love and joy. No, it was the smile of a woman who just decided that if this was going to be a war, then she damn well wasn't going to be the casualty. And if Robert thought he'd delivered the final word that night, he had no idea what was coming next. The thing about people like Robert Whitmore is that they're so used to controlling the narrative, they never stop to think someone might be quietly collecting the pieces of a story they've worked hard to bury. They walk around in tailored suits and smug self-assurance, convinced that everyone else is too naive, too polite, or too afraid to pull back the curtain and see what's really behind the show. But I've spent my life around people who wear masks for survival, not performance, people who hustle through hardship, who keep secrets not out of malice but necessity. So maybe that's why, when I started to feel that itch under my skin, that little whisper that said something wasn't right, I didn't ignore it. It started 3 weeks before the wedding, right in the middle of the chaos: guest list edits, seating charts, flower arrangements, dress fittings, all of it swirling like a damn tornado. I was exhausted, overstretched, and just trying to hold the whole thing together without losing my mind. And then Maya, my best friend, my anchor, my no bullshit compass, looked at me over coffee and said, "Katie, I don't trust that man. I mean it. Something's off about him." At first, I brushed it off. I told her she was just being overprotective again, that Robert was stiff and snobby, sure, but not dangerous. But she didn't drop it. She never does when her gut tells her something's wrong. "I don't know what it is," she said, her eyes narrowing the way they always do when she's thinking 2 steps ahead, "but he's hiding something. And I think you need to find out what." The words stuck with me like a splinter under the skin. I tried to shake them, but then, 2 nights later, I stayed late at the Whitmore estate after a dinner party. Andrew was off entertaining some guests, and I'd gone upstairs to grab my clutch from the guest bedroom when I heard it, Robert's voice behind his office door, low and tense, not the calm, measured tone he usually reserved for manipulating people. I shouldn't have stopped, but I did. I leaned in just enough to catch words that sliced through the heavy oak like razors. "She doesn't know. Keep it that way," he said. "It would ruin everything. This marriage is too high profile now." Something twisted in my gut. It wasn't just business talk. There was something personal in his tone, something edgy, something desperate. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay next to Andrew, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the hell his father could possibly be hiding that would ruin a wedding. The next morning, while Andrew was at work, I made a decision that I didn't think I was capable of, something cold, calculating, and deliberate. I hired a private investigator. A woman named Teresa, sharp as hell and twice as discreet. She didn't ask many questions, just took the file and said she'd be in touch. I told myself it was a precaution. I told myself I probably wouldn't need whatever she found. But deep down, something already knew, some instinct buried under all that bridal lace and champagne flutes was whispering that I wasn't just planning a wedding. I was preparing for a war. What she brought back, 5 days later, hit me like a brick to the chest. Photos, documents, phone records, all of it pointing to one unshakable truth. Robert Whitmore had a second family. Not a fling, not some Vegas weekend mistake. A second family. A woman named Linda Simmons, living in a small coastal town 3 hours away, with a daughter, Samantha, who was 27 years old and unmistakably his. The resemblance was brutal. Same eyes, same jawline, same arrogance etched into her face in every photo. It wasn't just scandalous, it was calculated. He'd been supporting them secretly for years, sending money under shell companies, keeping everything just far enough from the surface to maintain his pristine reputation. I stared at those photos for hours, trying to decide what to do. A part of me wanted to throw them at Andrew, demand answers, burn the whole house down right then and there. But another part, the colder, sharper part of me, decided to wait. I folded everything into a small envelope and tucked it away in a box with my wedding things. Just in case. Because something told me that a man who could hide a daughter for 27 years wouldn't hesitate to throw me under a bus if it protected his legacy. So when Robert stood up at my wedding and tried to humiliate me in front of everyone, I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I didn't fall apart. I reached down into my purse, pulled out that tiny envelope like a surgeon reaching for a scalpel, and looked him straight in the face. "Robert," I said, my voice calm, almost sweet, "I think you forgot to include someone in your speech. There are moments in life when silence feels heavier than any scream, thicker than any storm, and sharper than any knife, and when I stood in front of that room, holding that little envelope between my fingers like it weighed 1,000 pounds, I knew I was about to split that silence wide open and let the truth spill across the floor for everyone to see. My hand didn't shake, though God knows my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The music had stopped. The chatter had vanished. Every fork was frozen midair, every wine glass hovering like someone had hit pause on reality itself. All eyes were on me, but I didn't flinch. Not anymore. Robert was still standing at the head of the table, smug and satisfied, like he'd just handed down some final judgment from a marble pedestal. He didn't see it coming, not even when I slowly unfolded the flap of that envelope and pulled out the neatly typed pages. He thought he'd silence me with his carefully chosen words, that I'd shrink into myself and accept his humiliation like a good little outsider desperate for approval. But I've never been that girl. Not now. Not after everything. I think, I said, voice even and measured, since we're talking so openly about family tonight, it's only fair that everyone hears the full story. Don't you agree, Robert? He blinked just once, confused for a second like the script had suddenly changed, and he wasn't handed the next page. I watched his lips tighten slightly, that flicker of calculation in his eyes, but it was already too late. I turned to the crowd, friends, colleagues, relatives, strangers with expensive suits and sparkling jewelry, and I began to read. The letter was written by Samantha Whitmore, and I swear to you, by the time I finished the first paragraph, you could have heard a pin drop on that ballroom floor. It started simple. My name is Samantha Whitmore. I am 27 years old, and for most of my life, I've carried the burden of a secret I didn't choose. You could feel the collective breath of the room catch as the truth began unfolding, sentence by sentence, like a wound being opened in slow motion. She wrote about growing up in a small town, always wondering why her mother cried when the phone rang and then hung up with nothing but silence on the other end. She described how, for years, she believed her father was some long-gone mistake until the day she found a letter hidden in her mother's drawer, a letter from Robert, filled with promises he never intended to keep. I watched faces shift around me, shock, confusion, disbelief like a wave moving through the room. Some guests exchanged nervous glances, others looked down at their plates, suddenly uncomfortable with their own silence. Elaine's face had gone completely pale, her lipstick standing out like a smear of blood against white porcelain. Her hand trembled slightly on her wine glass, and for a second, I wondered if she'd throw it at me or at him. But she just sat there, stiff and stunned, eyes fixed on nothing. Samantha's letter didn't just tell a story, it bled. It talked about birthdays missed, holidays spent watching other kids with their fathers, the shame of being treated like a dirty secret by a man who had the audacity to lecture others about values and respect. And just when the room couldn't get any heavier, I finished the letter with Samantha's final words. He may never claim me, but that doesn't make me invisible. And it doesn't make him clean. Robert tried to speak, of course he did. He stepped forward, clearing his throat like he was about to give a lecture or launch into some damage control monologue, but I was faster. Don't even try, I said, cutting him off before he could form a single excuse. I have photographs, bank records, letters with your signature. You can lie to them if you want, but you and I both know what's true. I pulled out the copies, not the originals, those were safe elsewhere, and laid them on the table like playing cards in a final hand. People began to murmur. A few gasps, some whispers, heads turning like the truth was too loud to ignore now. Elaine still hadn't moved, but I saw the twitch in her jaw, the cracks starting to show in the perfect mask she'd worn for decades. Andrew was staring at me now, finally, but not with anger. No, it was something else. Something colder. Something sadder. Like a man watching the walls of his life fall down one by one, too slow to stop it and too afraid to admit he saw it coming all along. And that's when I turned to him, microphone still in hand, the echo of Samantha's words still hanging in the air like smoke. I looked at him, not just as my fiancé, not just as the man I thought I knew, but as someone I suddenly wasn't sure I'd ever really understood. You knew, didn't you? I asked, not yelling, not accusing, just stating it plainly, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. And the way his face fell told me everything I needed to know. There are wounds you can bandage and walk away from, and then there are the ones that cut so deep you don't even feel them at first. You just stand there bleeding quietly while the whole world spins around you, pretending everything's fine. That's what it felt like when Andrew opened his mouth and confirmed what I already knew deep in my gut, but hadn't wanted to admit to myself. The look on his face when I asked him if he knew said enough, but I needed to hear the words come out of his mouth, no matter how much it would hurt. His lips parted slowly, and his eyes darted around the room like he was searching for a safe place to land. But there wasn't one left. Not anymore. "Katie," he said, voice low and trembling in a way that made my stomach twist. I didn't know everything. Not exactly. I knew there was someone else, but I never asked questions. I didn't want to know more. He said it like that made it better, like willful ignorance was some kind of excuse for cowardice, and I stood there staring at him, feeling something in me harden like ice forming over cracked glass. "You didn't want to know more?" I repeated, and my voice was colder than I meant it to be, sharp enough that even Elaine flinched where she sat frozen in her chair. "You heard your father had another daughter, and you just decided to keep your head down and pretend it wasn't your problem?" He nodded, barely, like a child being scolded, but there was no innocence in that moment, just weakness. Just a man who chose comfort over courage and silence over standing beside the woman he claimed to love. I don't know exactly when the love I had for him started turning into something darker, but it was there now, quiet and bitter and creeping up my throat like poison. I looked at him and saw not the man who held my hand in bed or whispered promises into my ear late at night, but someone who stood by while his family gutted me in public and called it tradition. His silence had been its own kind of betrayal, one that felt more personal than Robert's speech or Elaine's icy glares ever could. I didn't even realize Jake had moved until I heard the crash. 1 second everything was still, and the next my brother was across the room with his fist buried in Robert's jaw. The sound was sickening, bone against bone, the thud of a man who'd been asking to be knocked down for years, finally getting what he deserved. People screamed. Glasses shattered. A couple of guests backed away from the table like the entire night had finally gone off the rails. Robert stumbled back, hand to his face, blood starting to drip from his nose as he yelled something incoherent about assault and respect, but no one was listening anymore. The truth had already cracked the foundation, and now the whole damn building was crumbling down around him. Andrew rushed to pull Jake off, but my brother shook him off like he was nothing more than a gnat buzzing in his ear. Maya appeared at my side like she always did in the moments that mattered most, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the exit. "You don't have to marry this mess," she whispered, her voice fierce and urgent as her fingers wrapped around my wrist. "You don't owe these people a damn thing, Katie. You don't owe them your dignity. You don't owe them your silence. Walk away, please." And for a second, I almost did. For a second, I thought maybe that was the cleanest way out, to take my brother and my best friend and leave that cursed ballroom behind me forever, let them all rot in their golden cage of secrets and lies. But then I saw the way some of the guests were already trying to regain control, whispers behind hands, nervous glances, someone even attempting to joke about the chaos like it could all be brushed under the rug with enough champagne. And that's when I realized something else. This wasn't just about me anymore. This wasn't just about a girl from a working-class family trying to marry into a dynasty. This was about every smug bastard in that room who thought they could rewrite the story just because they had money and polished manners. This was about making sure they remembered exactly what happened here tonight and who made it happen. I pulled my arm gently from Maya's grip, turned on my heel, and walked slowly back toward the front of the room, past shattered glass and spilled wine, past Robert clutching his face and Elaine silently unraveling in her chair. I picked up the microphone again, letting the feedback ring through the speakers like a warning bell before silence returned. I scanned the room one more time, meeting the eyes of every single person who'd been complicit with their silence, who'd watched me be humiliated and said nothing, who'd clutched their pearls and turned away when the truth got ugly. And then I leaned into the mic, calm and steady, and said, "I've got one more thing to say. There's a strange kind of peace that comes just before you burn a bridge you once dreamed of crossing. It's not loud, not dramatic, not even heavy the way people imagine. It's still. It's sharp. It's the sound of everything inside you finally going quiet after screaming for too long." That's exactly how I felt as I stood there, microphone in hand, staring out at a room full of people who didn't know whether to run or applaud, whether to look away in shame or lean in for more. I wasn't shaking anymore. I wasn't trying to be liked. I wasn't trying to be understood. I was just done pretending this life was something it wasn't. "I've got one more thing to say," I repeated, my voice steady, ringing through the speakers like the last warning bell before a demolition. Some people flinched. Others leaned forward. Elaine still hadn't moved, frozen in her seat like porcelain left out in the cold too long, and Robert sat slouched, blood dried under his nose, dignity nowhere to be found. Andrew was standing now too, a few feet away, unsure whether to come closer or disappear completely. "I walked into this marriage believing in love," I began, not just talking to them, but talking to every version of myself that had tried so hard to make this fairy tale work. I believed in compromise. I believed in building bridges. I believed that love was enough to make people accept you, even when you don't fit into the box they want you in. I took a breath, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted them to feel every damn word. "But the truth is," I continued, my gaze sweeping across the crowd, "this was never about love for you people. It was about image. It was about polish. It was about control. About how things look in photographs and business newsletters and gala donation write-ups. You didn't want a daughter-in-law. You wanted a trophy with a diploma, a pedigree, and a trust fund attached." A few guests looked away now, embarrassed, like they'd been caught eavesdropping on something private, but I didn't stop. I wouldn't stop now. You dressed it up in fancy speeches and polite smiles, but underneath all of it was the same old rot: elitism, hypocrisy, and fear. Fear that someone like me, someone with dirt under her fingernails and a spine built from struggle, might actually have the nerve to belong here. I looked straight at Robert, who was still trying to salvage the last pieces of his shattered reputation in his own mind. "You gave your little speech about class and values and who's good enough for this family, but you forgot something," I said, pausing just long enough to make it sting. "You forgot that lies rot from the inside out. You forgot that secrets always find their way to the surface. And you forgot that sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones who end up rewriting the entire damn story." There was no applause. Just silence. Just stillness. Just the sound of every assumption they'd ever made about me crumbling under the weight of truth. I looked down at my hand, the ring glinting under the lights, a beautiful, hollow symbol of something that no longer meant a thing. I pulled it off slowly, carefully, like removing a bandage from an old wound, and placed it gently on the table in front of me. It didn't clatter. It didn't make a sound. But the message rang louder than anything I could have said. I turned toward Andrew, and for the first time, I saw the full shape of his fear, not just fear of losing me, but fear of finally having to live without the shield of his father's lies. "You could have told me," I said softly, not for drama, not for sympathy, but just because it was true. "But you didn't. And that tells me everything." Then I turned away from him, from the legacy he was so afraid to disrupt, from the family that had tried to bury me under their silver spoons and tight smiles, and I walked out of my own wedding. I didn't rush. I didn't run. I walked with purpose, with dignity, with every ounce of strength I'd ever carved out of this brutal world. Jake followed without a word, always behind me like a shield. Maya slipped her hand into mine as we stepped past the shocked faces, past the open doors, past the hollow perfection that had tried to suffocate me. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky open, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, I could breathe. I didn't know where we were going next. I didn't have a plan, a backup, a perfect picture of what my life would look like tomorrow. But I knew I was free. I knew I had ripped off the mask, cracked the performance in half, and walked away before it could crush me entirely. And just when I thought the story was over, I remembered something else, one final thread dangling at the edge of all this chaos. I stopped on the front steps, turned slightly toward Maya and Jake, and let a quiet smile curl at the corner of my mouth. "Funny thing," I said, almost like a throwaway thought, almost like it didn't matter, but it did. "Samantha called me again last week. Said she had something else to tell me. Something about Andrew." They looked at me, eyes wide, waiting for more. But I just turned toward the open road, exhaled deeply, and added, "But that's a story for another day." And just like that, I walked into the unknown, not broken, not defeated, but reborn in the ashes of a wedding that was never meant to be a beginning. Maybe it was an end. Or maybe it was just the first chapter of something far more honest than love built on silence and secrets.